The stories presented in this video are real, but we have changed the characters' names and altered images to protect their identities. The creator of this video is not an investigative officer. These narratives have been sourced from various internet platforms. Our intent is not to accuse or target anyone in particular. Thank you for understanding.
Home is synonymous with safety. You are constantly aware that, without a shadow of a doubt, you are safe and comfortable inside the confines of the environment that you refer to as your hometown. As soon as you enter through your front door, you let out that sigh that you have been holding in for so long. It's the cozy and warm feeling when you go somewhere you're familiar with, your home. However, there are other individuals who are terrified of being attacked within their own residence. Despite the fact that it is something you do not wish to contemplate, you cannot pretend that the idea has not occurred to you at any point. Katie Sepich, who was 22 years old at the time, was reported missing from a party in Las Cruces, New Mexico. This caused everyone to be on edge. This must have been the worst dread of every single person, right? A dump in a rural area was where her body was discovered, which was an even more horrifying discovery. On the other hand, when the police conducted additional investigations, they discovered a horrifying realization. Katie's life was taken immediately outside of her home. There is nothing that appears to be the case in this perplexing investigation of Katie Sepich. This includes the crime scene, the suspects, and everything in between. What's worse is that it took detectives 3 years to get to the bottom of things. But even when the case was solved, the result was not at all what the detectives were expecting. Katie Sepich was born on the 26th of December 1980 in Carlsbad, New Mexico, to parents Dave and Jan Sepich. She was the oldest of 3 siblings, including a brother, AJ, and a sister, Carolyn. Katie was regarded as a sweet and caring child, yet being the oldest of her siblings, she had a controlling aura about her. But even though Katie was the type of person to make things go her way, she also looked out for the people that she loved. According to Katie's brother, AJ, she was his best friend and guardian, but she was also renowned for being a bit of a clown once you got to know her. According to one of her best friends, Katie would always make jokes about anything and everyone, including herself. She was the one who'd be the butt of a joke, but carried it off with elegance, grace, and comedy. Katie was a confident young lady who was highly likable. She was popular, had a lot of friends, and was generally well-liked by people who knew her. At the time of the case, Katie was attending New Mexico University, and she was seeking a degree in business administration, which sounded wonderful for her. She was confident, level-headed, and smart, so this was virtually the perfect professional route for her. She lived in an apartment on the east side of Las Cruces, New Mexico, which was close to her school, and she was also working part-time as a waitress at El Sombrero Patio Cafe, a highly vibrant and popular Las Cruces Mexican restaurant. Even though Katie was in college, she still didn't have any clue what she wanted to do after graduation. She may have been studying towards a degree, but it didn't imply she had a job lined up or anything like that. According to her mom, Jan, Katie wanted to change the world, and she had big ideas of doing something big, significant, and life-changing. She just didn't know what it was yet. At the time, Katie was also seeing someone. It was a fellow university student, Joe Bischoff, and he was majoring in biochemistry. They were both falling over heels for each other, and Katie truly viewed him as the person she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. Joe was equally enamored with Katie's feisty and charming attitude, so much so that he bought Katie a diamond promise ring. It was a nice gesture from Joe, and the two were looking forward to graduation, after which they would formally start their new lives. But things didn't go as to plan. See, after receiving her bachelor's degree, Katie decided to stay in university to get a master's degree, whereas Joe headed back to his hometown in Gallup, where he took a job. The two weren't broken up, they just had different things to do in life, and they would visit each other whenever they found time in their hectic schedules. But regrettably, Katie wouldn't get to do any of the things she wanted to do. Her plans were put on hold permanently since one terrible night in 2003 changed everything for the worse. On August 30th, 2003, Joe and Katie had arrangements to meet up in Las Cruces. Katie, her roommate Tracy, and Joe were invited to a college party in a nearby area that was about a mile from where Katie was living, and the goal was to have a fantastic time and then spend the night at the house since it was Labor Day weekend. The next morning, Tracy woke up and was alarmed to see that Katie was gone. Joe was present, and even Katie's possessions, including her pocketbook, cell phone, and house keys, were in the house. Tracy and Joe searched the house, rang up Katie's friends, and even went by Tracy's house to check for her, but there was no sign of Katie. Everyone was starting to worry about her, and that was when Tracy instantly got Katie's parents involved and asked them if Katie had visited. When her parents likewise had no idea where Katie was, she was reported missing by Tracy and Joe on August 31st. The investigators rushed into action, and they didn't have to look too long because on that same day, only hours after Katie was reported missing, a body was located. Some neighbors were wandering past an old Las Cruces waste site, and they saw something lying on the ground. It was a woman's body, and the detectives were promptly called to the scene. When the cops cordoned off the area and investigated the body, it was horrible. The body lied face down, disrobed, and it didn't take a genius to figure out that this woman had been taken advantage of. The corpse had defensive wounds on the arms and face, and there was DNA in the form of skin under the fingernails. Worse yet, the body had burn marks, which showed that the culprit tried to set her ablaze after the incident, but was unsuccessful. The investigators also spotted tire marks near the body. They seemed new, as though someone had used a car to drop her there. This prompted the cops to assume that the incident didn't take place in this deserted region. The one presumably had her life ended somewhere else, and then her body was dumped in the secluded part of Las Cruces. At this time, detectives didn't even know who the victim was, but because Katie had only recently been reported missing, the police had a strong inclination that it may be her. So Katie's dad, Dave, was called in for identification, and unfortunately, the body belonged to 22-year-old Katie Sepich, and her own dad was sadly the one to identify her. Investigators began to look closely at the persons who'd last seen Katie, and two of them were her best friend, Tracy, and her lover, Joe. When the cops questioned Joe, he indicated that they'd arrived at the party together, but after some time, he saw that Katie was nowhere to be found. He didn't think much of it, as he believed that maybe Katie had gone home early, but it wasn't until the next day when Katie didn't show up that he started to grow anxious. During the same time, a lot of police officers were charged with heading over to Katie's home and checking for anything out of the norm. As soon as they approached Katie's home, though, they did uncover something unusual. First of all, a pair of women's shoes was found abandoned underneath the bedroom window. It seemed as if someone had kicked them off haphazardly. Those shoes, you guessed it, belonged to Katie. When the detectives peered at the window above, they were stunned to see that the screen had been hurled onto the ground. The real window was locked and nothing was destroyed, but her screen was removed and thrown on the ground. So this led the investigators to come up with a theory. They felt that Katie did, in fact, leave the party, but as she arrived home, she realized she hadn't brought her keys and ultimately opted to climb up through the bedroom window in order to break into her own home. They suspected that Katie was fatigued and didn't feel like making the walk back to the house where the party was held to get her possessions, and it was during this time the police believed Katie was attacked. But the issue remained, who did it? Was it someone Katie knew? Was it a random attack? And why did Katie abandon the party? There were just too many story holes. So the investigators went back to questioning Katie's pals, and that was when they came to know why Katie left the party. Well, the reason was that she was unhappy at her boyfriend, Joe, because she caught him kissing another female at the party. The investigators found this immediately weird, not because Joe had now been expelled as a scoundrel, but more so because he never revealed this to the police. And now he had some explaining to do. When Joe was initially questioned by the police, he maintained that he didn't know why Katie left the party in the middle of the night, but it turns out he probably did know, and it was because of him. So this disclosure made the cops exceedingly suspicious of Joe because he'd lied to them. Eventually, Joe did reveal that Katie was angry with him, and it was the reason why she left. But he further added that he drove to Katie's house to check up on her by driving along her block, and even tried contacting her the morning that she went missing. Now, this was also unusual for investigators to hear. See, Joe knew that Katie had left her phone at the party, so why was he contacting her when he knew that she didn't have her phone on her? The investigators assumed that this was Joe's approach of covering up his tracks and trying to throw the police off, and this just made them more apprehensive of Joe. The authorities at this time only had one method to verify Joe's involvement, and that was through DNA. Now, it was the early 2000s, and DNA testing is not what it is nowadays. Still, scientists were able to compare DNA at the time, and detectives wanted to get their hands on Joe's DNA to check if he was the one behind Katie's attack. After all, she had DNA on her fingernails and on her body. But what Joe did next made the cops even more suspicious. He straight up denied donating his DNA for testing. This, to the cops, was a clear evidence Joe was hiding something. So, the police were stuck in the middle yet again. Sure, they had a strong suspicion that Joe was their person, but the evidence was circumstantial, and the only rock-solid way of confirming Joe's involvement was through DNA, which Joe elected not to submit to the detectives. Katie's family was equally outraged by Joe's behavior. This was the man whom Katie loved, and now he was being shady and obstructive, and he might have been behind Katie's demise for all that they knew. The Sepich family was going through all sorts of emotions, and none of them were lessening their sorrow. So, this was the start of a long search for Katie's killer, as well as trying to get Joe to donate his DNA for testing. The authorities, in the meantime, questioned every single male in Katie's life and tested their DNA against the DNA found on Katie, but none of them were a match. All the time, detectives kept a tight eye on Joe for any suspicious behavior, but there wasn't any, which perplexed the investigators even more. By this point, months passed, but suddenly the detectives unearthed some new information. See, the police were informed that on the night of the party, August 30th, Katie and Joe had been intimate with each other. So, the bedding in Katie's bedroom was analyzed, and they managed to locate traces of male DNA on it. When it was forwarded for matching, the results came back negative. The male DNA on the bed, quite likely Joe's, didn't match the DNA recovered on Katie's body. So the investigators felt that maybe Joe wasn't the offender after all, but they still wanted to find out for sure, and for that, they required DNA from the man himself. This is when the cops approached Joe, and they planned to let Joe know that his DNA didn't match the killer's, so now they wanted his DNA to confirm that he could be officially ruled out as a suspect. Luckily, and ultimately, Joe agreed and donated his DNA, and when this was checked, it was not a match to the killer's DNA. So, it wasn't Joe who terminated Katie's life, even though his actions and stories were sloppy. When Joe was asked about his reluctance to submit to the police, he stated he knew that he and Katie had gotten intimate hours previously, therefore he worried that the police would find his DNA on her and paint him as the killer. And while this was a severe letdown for Katie's family to learn, you can't really fault the guy. That was a really honest appraisal for him to have made, and he may have avoided a bullet there. But even though this is terrible to be framed for a crime, because of Joe's reluctance, 3 long months had gone since any progress was made in Katie's investigation. If only Joe had been forthcoming from the get-go, Katie's case wouldn't have advanced at such a snail's pace. So, Joe wasn't the killer, which meant that the investigators had to get back to looking for the genuine offender. They now felt that Katie's killer was most likely a stranger. With the DNA, the detectives were able to obtain the ethnicity of the killer, and it was concluded that the wrongdoer was probably a Hispanic male. Also, if you remember, There were tire tracks located where Katie's body was, and according to the police, they belonged to a pickup truck. So, the killer was most likely Hispanic. He most likely drove a pickup truck. And this was something the cops could go off of, but it was still quite ambiguous. The investigators were going through lead after lead, checking all the known offenders in the region. And Katie's family even put out a reward of $100,000 for any information on Katie. But regrettably, nothing turned up. Katie's mom, Jayanne, at one time started to lose all hope of ever finding justice for her daughter, and she held on to her will and didn't want Katie's case to go cold. The Sepich family tried anything they could to keep the issue on the forefront of people's minds, but just like that, 3 long years had passed. But time had provided Katie's parents some sort of optimism, because in December of 2006, a DNA match cropped up. See, the killer's DNA was transmitted to the Cody's database, and at that time, there wasn't a match. But 3 years later, Cody's reached out to the Las Cruces Police Department and gave them some great news for the first time in a very long time. So, who was this individual that had the same DNA as Katie's killer? Well, it was a 27-year-old named Gabriel Avila. Luckily, this man was already in prison in 2006 for aggravated burglary and assault, but this conviction was the reason why his DNA was sent into Cody's. Gabriel committed this act 3 months after Katie's attack. He broke into a residence armed with a knife, and he had plans to plunder the place and even attack the woman who lived there. Luckily, he didn't know that the woman also had a roommate, and when the woman heard the ruckus of Gabriel breaking in, well, he panicked and fled the area. He was eventually apprehended by the police, but he was put out on bond, and as soon as he got out, Gabriel went on the run. He managed to fly under the radar for almost 14 months before he was rearrested and convicted for the crime he tried to conduct in November of 2003. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison for the crimes. So, he was the man whose DNA matched Katie's killer. As he was still in detention, the police sought to get to know a little bit more about Gabriel to create a case against him. Well, the detectives found out that Gabriel was married at one point, albeit the couple had already divorced. The police wanted to meet his ex-wife and see if they could acquire any information about Gabriel and where he was on the night of August 30th. The police located the woman and were startled to hear that Gabriel did own a pickup truck in 2003, around the time when Katie's attack took place. But the smoking gun was something that Gabriel's then-wife spotted in the cup holder of the truck. It was a diamond ring. It was the ring Joe gifted to Katie that she wore all the time. I don't remember if I mentioned this previously, but when Katie's body was recovered, there was no ring on her finger. Even her parents pointed out that she wore it all the time, and yet it wasn't on her when her body was recovered. Gabriel had snatched the ring for whatever evil reason, but it benefited in the detectives' inquiry. This following section is going to sound like it's made up, but trust me, it is not. Gabriel's ex-wife still kept that ring in her hands 3 years after the occurrence. She felt that Gabriel was cheating on her, and I guess at this point she probably wished he had been, because the real tale behind the ring was considerably more terrible. This was the single most damaging piece of evidence that linked Gabriel to Katie's murder. The woman turned the ring back to the police, and now officers understood that they had to have an overdue conversation with Gabriel. Gabriel was now detained in prison in New Mexico, and when the investigators asked him about Katie Sepich, he initially pretended ignorance. The cops expected that much, and then they decided to charge straight in and show Gabriel the ring. It was as if Gabriel's whole mood changed when he saw the ring, and he knew that he couldn't keep up the lie any longer, and he eventually confessed to the awful murder. According to Gabriel, Katie was a stranger to him. On the night of August 30th, Gabriel was driving about in his pickup truck when he almost collided with someone walking on the street. That someone was unfortunately 22-year-old Katie, and that was how their paths intersected. Gabriel asked Katie if she needed a ride home, to which she rejected and kept walking. That should have been the end, but regrettably it wasn't. seeing a young, defenseless, and lone woman in the middle of the night stirred something extremely dreadful and dark in Gabriel, and he followed her home. As soon as Katie returned home and discovered she had lost her keys at the party, she decided to break into her own home via the bedroom window. Gabriel witnessed while this was happening, and that was when he leaped upon the opportunity that would tragically end in murder. Gabriel crept up behind Katie and pinned her to the ground. This was when Katie fought for her life. She strained all of her effort to fight off Gabriel and even managed to scratch him, but unhappily Gabriel had an advantage over Katie. He was much bigger than her, and soon he overcame her, forced himself on her, and then ended her life. When asked why he didn't just let her go after he obtained what he wanted, Gabriel simply responded that he was worried she would have gone to the police. After this, he loaded Katie's body into his truck, carried her to the landfill, and dumped her there, setting all the evidence on fire. Gabriel thought that the fire would erase all the evidence of the crime, but sometime after Gabriel left, the flames extinguished, either because of the wind or maybe there wasn't enough accelerant. But regardless, Gabriel's plans went down the drain unbeknownst to him, and this was the very thing that led to his downfall. After Gabriel's confession, he was charged with the assault and murder of Katie Sepich on December 26 of 2006, and he pleaded guilty. The jury condemned Gabriel Avila to 69 years in jail, which he had to serve after the 9 years for the burglary and conviction that he was also being tried for. He's still alive today, and is currently detained at Lea County Correctional Facility, a medium-security prison in Hobbs, New Mexico. DNA is a crucial piece of evidence in solving any crime like this, and thanks to it, Katie's case was brought to completion, but it was 3 years too late, and during that time, not only was an innocent man who was still a scumbag grilled by the police, but the actual perpetrator tried to commit another crime, although he was unsuccessful this time around. Katie's family was relieved following the sentencing, but they still felt as though more needed to be done to ensure that offenders don't get away with crimes just because their DNA isn't in a database. Following Gabriel's sentencing, the Sepich family petitioned for the passage of a new law called the Katie Sepich Enhanced DNA Collection Act of 2010, or simply Katie's Law. This rule was proposed by Katie's parents to enable prompt use of DNA and contemporary technology for catching offenders. The law proposes DNA collection of those who are arrested, charged with, or indicted for violent offenses such as assaults, murders, stalking, kidnapping, and abduction. The law also emphasizes using DNA samples to construct profiles to help capture and punish abusers on time, offering the family peace and closure while also preventing the perpetrator from harming anyone else. The governor of New Mexico at the time, Susana Martinez, who was also the prosecutor in Katie's case, signed the bill into law in April of 2011. In hindsight, the passing of Katie's Law is Katie's legacy, and her family is at ease knowing that Katie is being remembered to this day. This was not Katie's or her family's anticipation when she said she wanted to achieve something large or change the world, but regrettably, her unexpected contact with a stranger irreversibly altered the direction of her life. Katie's family misses her dearly, and there's not a day that goes by when her parents, siblings, and friends don't recall her smile and her eyes filled with light and optimism. We can only hope that with Gabriel's punishment, the Sepich family achieved some sort of closure, even though nothing in the world could fill the vacuum that Katie left behind. This scenario was extremely frightening. To think that a stranger may get agitated within seconds and do the unspeakable is just so terrifying. Katie and Gabriel didn't even know each other, but it didn't stop Gabriel, not just a stranger but a cruel, ruthless, and vile monster, from defiling and snatching the life of an innocent young woman. Katie's life hadn't really even started yet just like that, Gabriel took it upon himself to end it. But as always, if you loved this video, check out this other interesting case I covered. And don't forget to subscribe. It's entirely free and just keeps you up to speed with all my upcoming videos. I'll catch you guys in the next one.